speaking. In a moment, we will see Chairman Garnett Coleman, the chairman of the Legislative Study Group, one of our most senior members of the Texas House, will be here. We're joined by a good friend from Tarrant County, Chairwoman Nicole Collier, in his capacity as policy chair for the Mexican American Legislative Caucus. Jessica Gonzalez from Dallas is the vice chair of the House Elections Committee and is going to be leading the fight against some of these terrible voter suppression bills. We'll be hearing from her, as well as other colleagues on the Elections Committee, including Representative Sean Peckley from Denton County and Representative John Busey from Williamson County. The right to vote is elemental to our democracy. And efforts to make it more difficult for Texans to vote are an assault on the voters, certainly, but they're also an attack on the very underpinnings of our republic. And that's what Governor Abbott's remarks today were, as he again laid out more solutions in search of problems. In fact, today Governor Abbott was forced to admit there are no known cases of voter fraud in the 2020 election in Texas. Nonetheless, he continues with his campaign to distract Texans from his failures in last month's winter storm. Instead of telling Texans this irrefutable truth, that our elections are safe, secure, and free, the governor instead chooses to fan the flames of conspiracy theories by entangling Texas in this national Republican strategy to make it harder for Americans to vote. Why are Republicans doing this? Republicans continue to embrace Donald Trump's big lie that he didn't really lose the 2020 presidential election to President Biden. And so they resort to manufacturing false stories about election fraud. If Governor Abbott wants to talk about election integrity, he should start with this. When the voters have spoken, respect the results. The integrity of our elections means leaders must accept the results when things don't go your way. To paraphrase Mitt Romney, tell the voters the truth. Election integrity means allowing all eligible voters to vote, not erecting barriers to that fundamental right. And sadly, as you will hear from my colleagues, Texas has a long and shameful history of enacting barriers to the ballot box, especially for Texans of color. Texans House Democrats are going to fight relentlessly to protect all Texans' right to vote. We will oppose Republican policies that make it more difficult to cast a ballot or harder to register to vote. To talk more about this, it's my pleasure to introduce the Vice Chair of the Elections Committee, Representative Jessica Gonzalez.
Thank you, Chairman Turner. As Vice Chair of the Elections Committee, I am proud to stand here alongside with my colleagues to commit to fighting for legislation that will make participating in democracy and accessing the ballot box as simple as possible. I'm especially proud to serve on a critically important Elections Committee with my fellow champions of democracy, Representatives Michelle Beckley, John Busey, and Art Fierro, who unfortunately couldn't make it here today. During my time in President Obama's Department of Justice in the Voting Rights Division, I know firsthand how difficult it is to vote in our state. I also know that as a state representative for a district that is almost 90% non-white and 73% Latino, I also know this as a Latina myself. Republicans have been pushing laws for decades that make it harder for people like me, my family, and residents of my district to vote. Texas has one of the lowest turnout rates in the country, and Texas Democrats are working as hard as they can to push that turnout rate even lower. In 2020, Texas Republicans, led by Greg Abbott, did everything they could to limit your access to the ballot box and make sure your voice wasn't heard. In the face of one of the most catastrophic pandemics that our country has ever seen, the governor made it as difficult as possible for voters across Texas to access socially distant secure voting methods. While nearly every other state quickly moved to employ wide-scale vote by mail, Texas spent taxpayer dollars fighting our oldest, all the way to the Supreme Court to prevent anyone except our oldest citizens from voting by mail, a population that, by the way, is disproportionately white. Our Secretary of State consistently discouraged voting by refusing to require masks in our voting centers, not allowing local elected officials to enforce social distancing at the polls, and actively made our sites unsafe by offering too little, too late support for Texas local elections officials. Attorney General Paxton harassed county elections officials during this last election, preventing simple efforts to allow those concerned about COVID-19 to vote safely. Our Attorney General even filed a lawsuit with the U.S. Supreme Court that would have invalidated our election results in 4 states because his preferred candidate lost his bid for the presidency. For decades, Texas Republicans have been guilty of adding unnecessary obstacles to the ballot box and of undermining our trust in our elections processes when things don't go their way. These bills the governor is touting are just pages and pages of new laws that will only make it more difficult for you and your family to vote in future elections. They won't even increase security in elections, and they certainly won't restore integrity in our vote in our elections. But they will make sure fewer Texans have a say in who runs our state. It is time our state leaders prioritize policy proposals that increase our citizens' accessibility to the ballot box rather than adding unnecessary obstacles that effectively rig the elections for their side. That's not what democracy is about. That's not the direction that Texas should be heading. Next, I'm happy to introduce Chair Nicole Collier, Chair of the Texas Black Caucus. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about an important issue. I had the chance to listen to and watch the governor press conference today, and one thing I'll agree, voting fraud is not a myth. What is a myth is the notion of widespread voting fraud. He was correct. There's not an instance from the 2020 election that would raise the alarm. For the 87th legislative session, over 45 bills have been filed by my colleagues to address voter integrity. Since it began prosecuting election fraud cases, the Office of the Attorney General has resolved the prosecution of 531 election offenses. The Special Prosecutions Division, Election Fraud Section, currently has 508 offenses pending prosecution in court over the last 12 months. This is approximately 500% more. More than what? Is one voting fraud case enough to change and upend all the things that we've been working for since 1965? No. There are those who wish to control the narrative to push their own agenda. Well, let me redirect your attention to the real issues at hand. There are people still without power. There are people still without water from this last winter storm Uri because of the massive failure of our Texas power grid. That's the narrative we need to be talking about, not some made-up charge or event regarding elections. And we can't even talk about elections without talking about equity and equality, without acknowledging the disproportionate impact laws like these have on our Black and brown communities. We cannot ignore the racist history of the laws on our books that make it harder for our communities of color to vote. There's a long, well-documented history of Texas Republicans drawing discriminatory districts to take away the rights of people of color. In fact, only a couple of years ago, the state engaged in discriminatory voter purge that removed roughly 100,000 voters from the rolls, many of whom were Latino. Months later, after wasting hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars, that purge was halted thanks to the many civil rights organizations who fought for Texas voters. There are anti-voter efforts we heard from Governor Abbott and the legislators beside him are not new. This is another Republican effort in a long war to disenfranchise Texas voters, specifically voters of color. In fact, I read a little bit of the House Bill 6. It says that in order, whenever there is a death certificate, when the registrar of death certificates, they're supposed to turn over that to the Secretary of State, not in 10 days like the law says. They expect that to be done in 1 day. Let me tell you, Texans wanted their power on in 1 day. Texans wanted water back in 1 day. That did not happen, but yet they expect to see this other governmental entity to turn power back, to turn over documents, government documents, within 1 day. Well, I'm sure a lot of Texans would want to see a lot of things done in a day. So voting rights are human rights. All citizens of this state deserve to have their voices heard and to legally access the ballot box without fear. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Chairman Garnett Coleman from Harris County.
Thank you, and we have a lot of speakers, so I'm going to be brief. what's most important is we have great members on the elections committee. And you all responded very well, Jessica, Ms. Becky, Ms. Lucy. And it's good to have members who understand the elections process who are in the middle of this in the comments that are made by the chair and others. Let's be clear about this. This is a national rollout. It's a national rollout that started before today, and it's picked up again with this idea that there's this widespread fraud everywhere that doesn't exist. So again, we're trying to solve a problem, have a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, and the solution is what will take away people's right to vote and ability to cast their ballot. States and government should be about opening up the voting process, not closing it down. And I know that our members who serve on the elections committee are going to fight tooth and nail against these particular bills that work to narrow the ability for people to cast their right to vote. It's just a shame, because really it's veiled racism. It's racism because anybody would believe that somehow folks of color want to go cheat, and that we don't take our right to vote any less strong, or the idea that anyone would want to commit fraud than they do. As a matter of fact, we had to fight harder for it. So of course we want integrity in the voting system, but we don't want the voting system to work against the voters. And that's what these legislation and this rhetoric does. It works against the ability of the voters to exercise their right to vote. And that has been the MO of the Republican Party and Donald Trump and the people who believe that voting is not a right, that it's a privilege for their particular group of people. It's not. It's a right for everyone, and people should have the opportunity to exercise that right to vote. So, in this regard, this isn't the beginning. This is the rollout that you'll see going on between now and November of 2022. And that's what's important to understand. I'm sure there's something like this going on in every state. I know there is. So we're here today, and I'm here today to join with my colleagues to say enough is enough. This is not something that we take lightly. And if anybody expects us to take it lightly, they're mistaken. And I know that we can be as fervent as anybody else when it comes to our rights and the rights of our constituents, and we will be. And as long as this battle for someone to regain a right they already had continues, or to not lose it, we will be front and center fighting against it. Thank you.
Well said, Chairman Coleman. Well said. My name again is Eddie Rodriguez. I'm the policy chair for the Mexican American Legislative Caucus, and I will be brief. A lot of what I was going to say has already been eloquently said. Texas is the most difficult state in the nation to exercise your right to vote in, and that is especially true here in our black and brown communities. As public servants, we need to be making it easier, not harder to vote, and Democrats are committed to doing so. If the governor, Senator Betancourt, and Chairman King were serious about making every eligible voter get to vote, then these Democratic bills should be their priorities. House Bill 93 by Representative Jeannie Hinojosa designates a polling place location on college campuses with at least 8,000 students enrolled. House Bill 111 by Representative Mijares, Texans eligible to vote would be automatically registered when issued a driver's license or ID card, or when updated personal information on driver's license or ID card. And finally, and this is only a few bills, House Bill 350 by my colleague, Representative Israel, expands voter registration to online registration through the Secretary of State's office and an official state website. These are the things that encourage people to register to vote and encourages them to vote. This is what we should be doing as elected officials, as policymakers here in Texas, not what the governor is doing, not what Senator Betancourt is doing, not what Chairman Kane is doing, and not what the Republicans are doing all around the country, just as Chairman Coleman said. This is happening everywhere in the country. It's intentional, and we need to stop it now. I'd like to call up Representative Michelle Beckley, who sits on the House Elections Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Roger Gibson. I appreciate it. I can't believe, as a small business owner, that I'm having to talk about Governor Abbott's latest wild goose chase when we have a horrible pandemic response. Last week marked a full year since the governor's original COVID-19 disaster declaration went into place. It's been over 12 months of hardship, of illness, and of death for many of our neighbors and loved ones, all worsened under the governor's inconsistent leadership and ill-timed orders. His decision to require masks and corral business capacities came too late, and now his decision to roll back these orders came far too early. Exactly 1 month ago today, we all experienced one of the most catastrophic winter storms on record in Texas. Millions of Texans went without power and water for days. Millions of dollars were made by corporations while we froze in our homes. We still have not accounted for all the suffering, the economic cost, and the death. It is not right to talk about these disasters without acknowledging the disproportionate effect they've had on our communities of color. We know COVID-19 hits our brown and black neighbors harder and at higher rates, and we know that the recent blackouts were also worse for our marginalized communities. In this context, it is unbelievably insulting to watch the governor waste his time this morning patting himself on the back and championing for the most restrictive voting rights legislation since the era of Jim Crow laws. We as legislators have multiple crises affecting millions of Texans to come up with real solutions for this session. Every minute Governor Abbott spends on his political games that threaten your rights, diverts resources, and distracts from the real monumental challenges at hand. Democrats have been fighting this same fight for years, and we will continue to fight for the sacred right to vote. But we ask the governor to put his political ambitions and campaign speeches aside and to work with us and help our state recover from the damage this past year has caused. There are so many things that are more important for Texans right now. And now I'd like to hand things over to Representative Busey, who also sits on the Elections Committee with me. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm State Representative John Busey. I'm happy to be here with all of you and our colleagues who have said such powerful words today about our fight for election access for everybody. 2 Thursdays ago, just 2 weeks ago, the Secretary of State's office stood in front of the House Committee on Elections and told us that the Texas's 2020 elections were a success and that they were smooth and secure. What has changed in the last 2 weeks? Voting rights should not be politicized for personal gain. Instead of over-criminalization and making it harder for Texans to vote, we must uphold and restore the public's confidence in our electoral systems, which means maximizing both participation and security. These goals are not mutually exclusive. They can go hand in hand. That's why this session we must pass online voter registration. This is the most important thing that Texas could do to improve the accuracy of our voter rolls and uphold election integrity while implementing online voter registration. 500,000 Texans, 500,000, have registered to vote online since September of 2020 when the DPS began offering it as a result of a federal court decision. And as they told the House Elections Committee also just 2 weeks ago, the system is working well and without complication. Shore up ballot by mail and implement a statewide tracker for applications and ballots. Expand access to early voting by using county-wide vote centers and flexible hours for shift workers. Put polling places on college campuses and allow students to use their photo IDs to vote. And we must improve access to the ballot box for Texans with disabilities or who have a language barrier. This is the agenda for Texas to help us move forward to make sure everyone has access to the ballot box. Having just concluded an election cycle where a higher percentage of Texans cast their vote in the past 30 years, in spite of the barriers provided by the COVID-19 pandemic, the legislature cannot, in good faith, convene and respond by making it harder for Texans to vote. Criminalizing democracy and undermining faith in the integrity of our elections discourage civic participation. I believe as elected public servants, we must work together to find solutions to the problems facing our state. And in that vein, I hope we can work with Chairman King, Speaker Phelan, our colleagues in the Texas House and the Senate on both sides of the aisle to ensure every eligible Texan can exercise their most fundamental right to vote and participate in our democracy, and have confidence at the same time in our electoral system. This is what we must do, and the House Democratic Caucus and our friends in the Senate are committed to making sure this gets done. So now to hear from the Senate, I want to bring up our good friend and champion across the Capitol, Senator Nathan Johnson, who's here representing the Senate Democratic Caucus.
Thank you, my friend John, and my friends and colleagues from the House. Senate Democratic Caucus, the House Democratic Caucus, we're all for election integrity. Every Republican's for election integrity. Election integrity is essential. It's essential because if we have fragile election systems, we get the wrong result, and it undermines the legitimacy of our government. We have already seen what happens when we allow a poorly researched, careless, perhaps pursued with ill intent narrative is forced upon the public. We have a siege on the Capitol. We have a wave, as Chairman Coleman explained to us, across the nation of voter suppression laws in reaction to a false narrative that undermines our election integrity. So one of the things that worries me about the bill in the House and the bill in the Senate is that the very presence of this bill reinforces something that's false to begin with. That we need to correct what went wrong, when actually, after all this investigation, after all these court cases, we can't find actually anything that went wrong. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing from the past. Nothing that's out of the ordinary in comparison with the past, and yet here we are with a bill supposedly about election integrity that is anything but. But I think it's important just to demonstrate that Democrats and Republicans are really objectively for election integrity. Let's examine a couple of things in SB 7 that aren't so objectionable. They want a paper trail. I think that would be fine. We could have certainty in our elections. Let's have a paper trail. There may be a tracking system to track mail-in ballots, who's turned them in, who hasn't. There was so much confusion. Great, let's do that. You know what, let's keep our polling places open for 12 hours a day from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., unless you're putting that in there as a way to secretly knock out the polling places that are on college campuses. So let's be sure that we're honest in our legislation. Now, what's bad about this bill? Why are we so upset about it? Let's just look at a few things. Requiring all counties to have all their countywide polling places have the same number of polling machines. What on earth are we talking about? This is micromanaging the electoral process, which is supposed to be entrusted to the counties. And it's supposing that in a big city like Dallas or Houston, that the concentrations of populations would be just as well served as they would be in rural counties where there's only a few people by setting up the polling places exactly the same. You know what? Our local county election officials understand how their public will best be served, how voters will have greatest access to the ballot. There's racial lines, there's other socio-demographic lines, and there's a rural-urban Democrat-Republican partisan divide when it comes to telling counties how many voting machines they got to have in a mega polling place. This is absurd. Absurd thing number 2, paperwork for people who want to drive people to the polls. I want to give my friend a ride and I got to fill out some forms. Who's in favor of a big bloated bureaucratic state that requires paperwork for the simplest of civic actions? We're not. Third thing, requiring anybody who requests an absentee ballot to include a note from their doctor that says, no, I really am sick. How do you think the physicians are going to feel about that? You know how many calls they're going to get to have everybody write a doctor's note so they can get an absentee ballot? My gosh. So we're not for a big bloated government. We don't want the big brother Orwellian state looking over everyone's shoulder and making sure you have a doctor's note and paperwork so you can drive your family member to the polls or your friends to the polls. We would like a voting system that truly has integrity. The many good things that have been mentioned from my colleagues, the things I mentioned earlier in this, those are things that will make us have good elections, and we can all be certain, and we cannot carry on for thousands of hours and millions of dollars of resources undermining the public's confidence in our election system. So let's fix the bill in the House. Let's fix the bill in the Senate. Let's strike out the provisions that are patently designed to suppress the vote. Let's go ahead and hone and make effective those that truly do contribute to the election, to the integrity of our election systems, because we'll all benefit from that, and there are plenty of good ideas out there to make that happen. So I do hope that our Republican colleagues will work with us on this, and that they will abandon this crusade to reinforce what essentially has been a big lie to the public about what happened in our presidential elections and about what happens in our elections here in the state. You know, one statistic, and I'll stop talking. After 22,000 staff hours, Attorney General Ken Paxton's office found 16 minor voting offenses. That means like your address wasn't the same on your voter ID card as it is presently. Out of 11 million ballots cast. Now, I got a little calculator on my phone, and it tells me that that's 15 10,000ths of the votes cast have a little minor problem. And we're going to have an omnibus voter suppression bill in response? I don't think so. I hope not. I'm glad to be here with my colleagues supporting good election integrity reform. And now, Chairman Chris Turner.
Thank you very much, Senator. When I was introducing people earlier, I didn't introduce you because I knew you were in a vote on the Senate floor, so I didn't know if you'd be able to make it in time, but we're so glad you're able to join us on behalf of our Senate Democratic colleagues. Thank you for being here. Thank you to all my colleagues in the House. We'll be glad to take a few questions.
So Governor Abbott, obviously, he mentioned that this was a bipartisan thing, and then obviously went from that to mentioning the two bills. What's your response to that? I guess that frame, quite honestly.
Well, I did hear the governor say something about bipartisanship, and he referenced something under President Obama's leadership, where there was a case of voter fraud that was prosecuted. What I would say is that that example proves that we have laws on the books to prosecute real voter fraud, as was the case in that example the governor gave. The Republicans, Governor Abbott, Donald Trump, and others, have yet to prove why we need more laws, why we need new laws, because they can't prove that fraud exists, just as Senator Johnson and many others have said today. So the idea that this is bipartisan is far-fetched. That's simply not the case.
Senator, can we ask you a real quick question, please, sir? Certainly. Get back to that mic. Back before the November vote, what seemed to have really got the ball rolling in regards to the controversy was the expanding of the absentee ballots and the mail-in ballots program, the mass mailing of stuff. We learned that other states do make the mass mailings available, or anyone can have a mail-in ballot. Is there any talk in regards to the reforms that y'all are talking about of taking those models that are already in place and bringing them here in Texas? Because we know they work in Colorado, we know they work in other states, and address some of the concerns that people had. Because what I heard back before November was, yeah, it sounds like a great idea, but we're trying to do it at a drop of a hat and trying to build a mechanism in place. Is there anything to bring those models here to Texas?
I'd be happy to comment on it, and I'm sure my colleagues could too. There's always conversation about these things. We've got empirical models throughout the nation of universal mail-in ballot functioning quite well. And I would be happy and welcome that here in Texas. Particularly during the pandemic, we thought it was essential, and many of us advocated for that vociferously. We couldn't even get it done during a pandemic. So in all candor, I'm not optimistic that that legislation would get through either chamber this session. I would love to be wrong about that, though.
I'll just add, I filed a bill. We have bills for no excuse ballot by mail. We've been voting by mail in Texas for about 100 years. It's safe, it's secure, it works, and every citizen should have equal access to that. So we should pass no excuse ballot by mail. We should pass any bill that's safe and secure and expands voting access for all Texans that are eligible. And so I hope we can get it done. We're asking for bipartisan support to get this done. Let's make balloting by mail accessible to everybody, and let's make voting easier.
I just wanted to add the bipartisan result of this. The statistical analysis that's been done of other states have found no partisan favor as a result of switching to universal mail-in ballot. Not Republican, not Democrat. So there really shouldn't be a reason to oppose this. It increases voter turnout. It doesn't cast any favoritism, and it's cheaper.
Eddie, Representative Israel's not here to talk about the online registration. Can you talk a little bit about that? That's something that the local voter registrar believes in, says that it's secure, it's fast, it can be done without... Yeah, so explain how that works.
Well, I don't know all the ins and outs of that bill since it's not my bill, but I do know enough about it. I think that we have the technology to make that work. I mean, we do so many things online now, from meetings to seeing your doctor to school even, that I think that we have secure systems in place, and I think it's time for our elections to go into the 21st century, just like a lot of other things we've been doing. So I think that we have some support, not only from Travis County elections officials, but I think around the state as well.
And one of the things that dealing with the online idea and also the mail-in idea is that y'all aren't advocating just open it all up. There's cross-checks, there's fail-safes involved, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you still have to be registered to vote. There's checks there. There's plenty of checks and balances throughout the entire process before anyone can vote or can register. So there's a lot of we've been doing this for a long time. And as has been stated many times, there's very minuscule instances of fraud. And so it works. It's secure already. So we have the technology now, and I think we should move forward with it.
So in Dallas County, they're doing studies on how many of the white voter ID, voter registration cards, and then voter registrar information, how much of it is thrown out because they can't read the handwriting, the address, the number's wrong, they're dyslexic, and how many of those people have to file, they go to the polls and then they can't vote. The number is staggering, and if we did online voter registration, it would eliminate all of those issues. So there's some data being collected in Dallas County on that.
Is there any concern about foreign interference that was alleged in 2016? Do you think there's any possibility for Democrats to kind of address that with these bills that Republicans are pushing for? Foreign interference?
Well, it's well documented that, there was a lot of foreign interference in the 2016 election. That the Russian government had a very orchestrated plan to affect our national elections. Look, it's something that I think our entire country has to be very vigilant about. We have to have secure elections. And clearly we've seen that election systems in some states across the country have been vulnerable to cyber attack. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think that's very, very much something that hopefully will be a nonpartisan or bipartisan area of agreement, saying that we want to make sure we absolutely protect our election, the logistics and the fundamentals of our election process, the infrastructure of our process, so that they're pervious to hostile foreign attacks. All right. Well, thank you all for coming today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Eddie, for letting me...